Hello, and welcome back to Rails Quest. Today we're going to talk about how you can solve some of your common performance issues. In fact, I'd like to start talking about a few more fundamental tips to Rails development that any well-rounded Rails developer should know about. There's actually been some developments that are really exciting in the last few years in Rails. So even if you've been a Rails developer for a long time, there may be a few tips in here that you haven't seen before and that you'd like to make use of. I'm excited for you to join me on this quick rundown. Instead of showing a gem spotlight today, like I've been doing a lot of lately, I'm going to show a feature that is built into Rails since Rails 6.1, and it's gotten some updates in Rails 7. So if you are at least on Rails 7, you should be good to apply any of the things that we talk about today. The topic of today's video is Rails strict loading. Before we talk about what strict loading means, maybe it's more important to talk about some of the problems that it was intended to address. Once you understand the motivation for why they added this feature to Rails, understanding what the feature does for you becomes pretty automatic at that point, and then we can just apply it to the code. So you can see right behind me here, I'm looking at the Ruby on Rails guides. There's a wealth of information. If you ever have a moment to sit down and read some of the Ruby on Rails guides that come straight from the Rails team, you'll discover new tricks that you hadn't thought of before, and maybe one will jump out at you that is relevant to your situation right now. You never know when it'll be helpful. I encourage you to peruse them frequently. Today we're going to take a look at how does Rails help you solve the N+1 queries problem. So they have a helpful little code example here that shows you what this problem is. And taking a step back for just a moment, if you have been a software developer for a while, maybe a web developer or whatever, and you've encountered SQL databases, you might wonder why frameworks like Rails have these fancy mechanisms for accessing the database when it's all just SQL anyway. The reason for that may be outside the scope of this video, but those Rails helpers generate a lot of SQL for you that you didn't have to write. And this N+1 queries problem is one of the costs that we pay for having the convenience of being able to write book author or book limit 10 instead of the SQL equivalent. Maybe in this case it's select star from books limit 10, or maybe you have a different syntax on a different database. And now we start to realize that SQL is not necessarily standardized across all the different databases. So there is a good reason why we use an ORM, which some people may or may not disagree with. But today we're going to talk about a weakness of using an ORM. ORM stands for Object Relation Mapping. You may be aware that these SQL tables have relationships to each other, and when you query them, it's often used in the vernacular to refer to that as a relation. Since Rails or Ruby is an object-oriented language, and Rails models your data in an object-oriented way, the ORM, or Object Relation Mapping, it allows you to map your relations in the database to Ruby objects that you can deal with in Rails very easily. Active record is our ORM in Rails. This is some very simple active record. Simple but effective. When you say book limit 10, you end up with a list of 10 books that was queried from the database. The first 10 that it grabbed in some non-deterministic ordering, right? Then you can iterate over the books as though it was an array. It's not an array, but you can interact with it as though it was a simple array. So that is really nice for usability. But here is where the devil is in the details. So we're doing something a little naive here. We are getting the list of books. Then for each book, we are printing out the last name of the author. Every iteration through this loop, so 10 times, it's going to go and say book author. That book author is a nice bit of active record code where if you were looking at this book model, it would say belongs to author or maybe has one author. In either case, it's referencing a different table, probably the authors table. You'll notice that we loaded from the books table here. We don't have data from the authors table, so it has to go and fetch that data. If you have a belongs to association, then what you have here on the book is an author ID. If you have one association, the author has a book ID or something similar to relate it to the book. In either case, it needs to run a query to the database to get that author, and then it can show you the last name. And it does this 10 times. So we're looking at one query to get our books, then 10 more queries to get all of our authors' last names. And you can see here the code looks fine at first sight, but the problem lies within the total number of queries executed. So you end up with n plus 1. You're fetching n records, and you are making n plus 1 queries because you're making a fetch first for the list, and then on each item in the list, you're making another query to load a little bit more data. So solutions to the n plus 1 queries problem, you can stick includes or preloads or eager loads in front of the data that needs to be loaded before it is used. This is great. This is how you would solve it with includes. This only does 2 queries. It loads your books and then it loads your authors. Yes, and here are queries involved, assuming that the performance of accessing your database matches the normal case. This is going to be better for your performance than what we looked at before, especially as the n number grows. You're going to really be hammering that database to fetch all of those records. So I will leave it as an exercise for y'all to read more about that. What I'm going to look at is a setting in Rails that turns on strict loading. Strict loading will allow you to get an early warning sign before you go to production with queries that could cause problems in the future, like n plus 1 queries. Strict loading will make sure that you intended to load everything that you end up loading. You can see how this could be a problem with the way Rails separates the view logic from the controller logic, where you might be doing a lot of fetching before you render your view. But in your view, since you're dealing with these smart active record models, your view might load an association innocently, thinking that it's already there and ready to be loaded, when in fact it was not. And then your view is triggering a query to your database. And if this happens in a collection or in a list of things in your view, well, there you go. You've got your n plus 1 query in your view. Turning on strict loading is one way to help us from shooting ourselves in the foot with this particular kind of problem. So let's take a look at a little bit of code. Here we have a conversions index page. This app converts YouTube videos to tweets, and we have a list of our conversions from YouTube video to tweet. This is going to be a good page to demonstrate what we're talking about here. So this is very similar to what we were seeing in the documentation for Rails. Up here we have the n plus 1 queries problem, book limit 10. Right here in the controller, we are fetching the conversions for the current user, limiting them to 10. We're just adding the order to make it deterministic. And we also add a duplicated order here, which we don't need. This application is not configured with any of the default strict loading. So in order to get it in this particular location, we can just chain it right onto first query here for current user and see if we pass muster. Here we go. This is the exact error you would expect to see if you have a violation for your strict loading. If you are optimizing or building your performance strategy around reducing the number of SQL queries or round trips to the database, this can be really helpful in ferreting out those sneaky ways that you are accessing the database and not realizing it was triggering another query. It explains what's going on. Conversion is marked for strict loading. The input association named input cannot be lazily loaded. This one's particularly sneaky because it was hidden behind a title. Let's see if we can get further down in the trace here. So this is all directly in the index HTML, so we can take a easy look at it in just a moment. But here in context of the error, we're accessing this title. It seems innocuous, but behind the scenes, we are delegating to input. You see how useful this has been already. Since this has a nice API, it's not something I would want to change, but it's helpful to know that I am loading data there. Remember, the way we can solve this problem is at the query level. So here's our delegating title to input, and you can see input is just a belongs to association. There's nothing fancy there. And you see that we're moving down the chain here. Okay, so now that I've followed the chain of strict loading and I've added all the things that were loaded, here in my controller I have a clear list of all the data that I'm loading into my view. So again, if this is your optimization strategy, when you add this strict loading in front of your query, you can be certain that everything that's chained off of this conversions variable is going to be safe. It's not going to make any extra trips to the database. Now, I've been putting a lot of caveats around if this is your performance strategy. The alternative performance strategies are not necessarily in the scope for this video. I really want to stress that you do your own research, make your own benchmarks and measurements, make your performance changes to your application based on your own real data. Don't ever follow anything somebody on YouTube tells you to do when it comes to the performance of your application. Unless, like I'm doing here, they tell you to go make your own measurements, determine what your actual usage is, determine where your hotspots are, and focus your efforts on where it really matters. Don't just chase something because somebody mentioned it on social media. Make informed decisions. Coming to those informed decisions is another series of videos that we could do. There are lots of tools we could mention, but in this case, if you are battling N+1 queries, this is a great tool to have in your arsenal. Speaking of tools, I've got this Rack Mini Profiler installed in this application, so you can see that the queries went down. Just a handful of SQL queries. Let's see if I can't comment that out, load the page. I see that we've got more milliseconds. We have 26 SQL queries before this optimization. I'll re-enable the eager loading there, refresh the page, and now we should just have one SQL query per table that needed to be loaded. You could do more analysis on this and probably find other ways to improve the performance. Last thing we're going to do is, if you're really brave or you're starting a brand new Rails application, you can actually enable this at a configuration level. So this active record action on strict loading violation, all these strict loading by default, strict loading mode, these three work together to configure your overall Rails strict loading strategy. So if you want to turn on strict loading by default, probably not the best strategy to adopt for an existing Rails application, but just for the case of illustration, let's say turn on strict loading by default and restart the Rails application. The page that we just fixed should be good to go. Let's wait for it to load. Oh, except we've got some session loading that's happening in the current user controller. So already you see how this can be pretty sneaky, and you can play a little bit of whack-a-mole here, trying to figure out at what level do you actually want to strict load things. So rather than troubleshoot this particular error, I'll show you a less aggressive way to set this up. Instead of raising an error, which might be something that you want to do once you get to a point where you've fully embraced this style of programming. Again, I'm not going to be prescriptive about it and say that it's the right thing to do. It may not even be the right thing to do for anyone. There might be a little bit of wiggle room, especially in situations like this where you're just loading a user off of the session. That is a common thing to do, so it might be something that you want to optimize. Again, it's going to be based on your specific situation. But here we can say action on strict loading violation is to log. Strict loading by default, and then we can log the strict loading violation. Let's refresh this page. Now the page comes up. We haven't changed anything in the code other than the configuration, but we do get a warning in the logs. That might be an acceptable level of friction for you and your team. That's something that you'll want to figure out. There's a third configuration that we can also look at, which is the strict loading mode. It is set to all by default, and it can be changed to N+1 only. Now, when we refresh this page, after we restart the server and then refresh the page, that error disappeared. We have limited it to only the N+1. Instead of being super strict and saying you can't ever load lazily, we're relaxing the requirements a little with this configuration option. We're saying N+1 only is going to cause an error or a violation. And remember, that's this problem right here where you're loading a list of things, and then for each thing you are loading more things. That is N+1. We restart the Rails server, we reload the page, and we're able to reload the page. But But if we make a violation of the n+1 rule, we still get the helpful error telling us to go fix that. So again, we've got on this next page, since this is a global configuration, notice I don't have anything about strict loading here. That's because I have configured it in the development config. When I navigate to another page where I have not made these optimizations, we get this violation again. If I also added that configuration to the test suite or to the test environment, then we would get those errors in our tests as well, which may be the most helpful place to put something as extreme as raising an error. If you like to reduce the number of n+1 queries in your applications, this may be something that you configure right off the bat in your new Rails applications so that you never have to worry about the n+1 queries again. That about wraps up this topic today. There are several other varieties of strict loading, and I'll leave that as an exercise for you all to go and look at the documentation and see what other fun ways you can use this. You can set it as an option on associations, and there's a few other Easter eggs here as well. I hope you have a wonderful week. Please let me know what you liked about this video, what you didn't like. Comment below, like it, subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Goodbye.